Welcome to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast, a weekly podcast where you get to discover the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Here's your host, Roland. Hi, my name is Roland, and welcome back to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast. As you know, this is a podcast where we consider the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Once again, I want to start the podcast episode by saying thank you to everyone who supported the podcast so far. I also want to apologize for the delay in making the podcast episode available this week. It was supposed to go out on Monday, but due to poor planning on my side, I wasn't able to put it out on Monday, so I'm going to put it out on Thursday, the 7th of November. Now, the reason I couldn't put it out is because the content for this particular episode was way more than I thought it would be. So as I was preparing this episode, I realized that if I'm going to present all the information that I've compiled for this episode might be an hour and a half long. So I've decided not to do that. I'm going to do one part of the presentation today, and then next week we can continue. So today I'm going to focus specifically on the manuscript evidence for the New Testament. Now, just to remind you guys, in the previous episode we used 3 arguments for the existence of God. We spoke about the cosmological, the teleological, and the moral arguments. And we used those arguments to build a kind of a profile of the kind of being or the kind of cause that would be necessary to create and sustain our particular universe. Now, this cause is often called the primary reality or the uncaused first cause. In theological circles, we simply call this being God. Now, looking at those 3 arguments, we realized or we determined that God must have the following attributes. Firstly, God must be uncaused. Secondly, God must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Thirdly, God must be powerful. Fourthly, God must be intelligent. Fifth, he must be personal. Sixth, he must be moral, or the moral standard, or the absolute standard of goodness. Now, you can listen to the previous episodes in order to get more detail on the reasoning behind this. But after we establish this kind of profile of the first cause or the primary reality or God, we then looked at the different worldviews in order to determine if their conception of God is compatible with the profile that we have built. So we looked at atheism, agnosticism, pantheism, panentheism, deism, polytheism, and monotheism. Now, again, I refer you back to the previous episode to get more context. So after we looked at these different worldviews, we confirmed that monotheism is perfectly compatible with the profile of God that we've established earlier. The monotheists believe in a personal God who created the universe from nothing. They believe that this being is eternal, omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, omniscient, meaning all-knowing, omnipresent, meaning everywhere at the same time, and self-sustaining and infinite. Now again, this corresponds to the attributes of God that we can infer from the scientific and the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Now, as I mentioned in the previous episode, there are 3 major monotheistic religions. It's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So the question comes to my mind, which of these religions are true? Can they perhaps all be true? Well, there are actually many superficial similarities between these 3 religions, like the concept of God or their reference to characters like Abraham or Moses. But there is at least one fundamental difference between these 3 worldviews or world religions, and that is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, or what they might call traditional Judaism, Jews do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, or that he was divine, or that he was a prophet. Some Orthodox Jews believe that he was a teacher or maybe a charismatic leader, while others believe that he was a heretic that was crucified for his heresy. Now, in terms of Islam, Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet and that he was born of a virgin, and that Jesus was nailed to a cross. Muslims, however, do not believe that Jesus died on the cross, but rather that he only appeared to die, but was actually saved by Allah. Now, in a Christian context, Christians believe that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was God's great prophet, and that Jesus was God himself. They believe that Jesus was crucified and that he died on the cross, and that he rose from the dead to prove that he was God. Now, obviously, as you can see, there are undeniable differences between Jewish, Muslim, and Christian understandings of God or of Jesus. Now, these differences contradict one another, and therefore they cannot all be true in the same sense. So, which one of them is true? This is the question that I will start to answer in today's episode. So the question is Christianity true? So I will try to show that Christianity is true by establishing the New Testament documents as historically reliable. Secondly, I will examine the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So this is important, friend. If the New Testament documents are reliable, and if the evidence shows that Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, then Orthodox Judaism and Islam is false. This is very important. We need to understand this, okay? So as I mentioned earlier, the first term in proving, or the first step in proving that Christianity is the true monotheistic religion is to establish the reliability of the New Testament documents. But what do we mean by reliable? At this point, I think it's important for us to distinguish between two terms. We need to distinguish between reliability and inerrancy. So what is reliability? Reliability, according to the dictionary, is the quality of being trustworthy or performing consistently well. So, for example, someone might say, the car's background gives me every confidence in its reliability. Reliability is also the degree to which the result of a measurement or a calculation or a specification can be depended on to be accurate. So, to say that something is reliable is to say that it is consistent and accurate. Now, what is inerrancy? Inerrancy, according to the dictionary, is to say that something is incapable of being wrong. So this is often referred to when speaking about the Bible. They might say that the Bible is believed to be an inerrant document or inerrant scripture. So to say that something is inerrant is to say that it is perfect and without error. So then, which of these two terms or standards for truth is applicable to the Bible? Well, when we are considering the Bible as a historical document, we are seeking to know if the information recorded in the Bible is accurate and consistent as it corresponds to other relevant historical considerations like other relevant documents, archaeology, culture, language, time periods, those kinds of things. Therefore, we employ the standard of reliability. When we speak about historicity, historical accuracy, we are speaking about reliability. However, if we are considering the teaching of the Bible as the self-proclaimed Word of God, then we expect the Bible should be without error in all that it teaches. In that case, we employ the standard for inerrancy. Does it make sense? Okay, so in this episode, I will not be arguing for the inerrancy of the Bible, but rather I will be arguing for the historical reliability of the Bible. So let's start with manuscript evidence. This is what this episode is going to be about. One of the objections I hear a lot with regards to the reliability of the Bible is the fact that the manuscripts have been copied so many times. It's been copied many, many times over the course of 2,000 years. They refer to the telephone game to demonstrate that the manuscripts must have been degraded or corrupted simply by the fact that it has been copied so many times. However, the New Testament was not transmitted that way. We need to understand this. It was not told to one person who told it to another and so on. So the problem from the telephone game does not apply to the manuscripts of the Bible. Many people independently witnessed the New Testament events. They committed it to memory, meaning they remembered it, and then 9 of those eyewitnesses or contemporaries of the eyewitnesses, meaning people that walked with the eyewitnesses or knew them, they put their observations in writing. Now remember, when we speak about the New Testament, we are not speaking about one writing. The New Testament is a collection of 27 different documents that were written on 27 different scrolls by 9 different writers over a 20 to 50 year period. So the New Testament is not just one source, like with the telephone game. No, the New Testament is a collection of sources. Now, the only real objection that I think anyone can raise against the Bible or against the New Testament, is the fact that so far, none of the original written documents, which are called autographs, none of these original documents of the New Testament have been discovered. We only have copies, and these copies are called manuscripts. We have copies of the original writings. But does that mean we cannot know what the original said? Not at all. All significant literature from the ancient world is reconstructed into its original form by comparing the manuscripts that survive. So the more manuscripts we have, and the earlier they were written, the more reliable, accurate, or trustworthy our reconstruction of the original text will be. So, how many New Testament manuscripts do we have? And how early were they written? These are important questions. So the truth is, and this is astounding, think about this. The truth is that the New Testament documents have more manuscripts that were written earlier and that were more abundantly supported than any other piece of classic literature. Wow. What do we mean by that? So, there are more manuscripts of the Bible than any other document in ancient history. There are approximately 5,800 handwritten Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. In addition to that, there are approximately 20,000 manuscripts in other languages like Latin or Syriac or Coptic or Arabic. Some of these manuscripts are complete collections. Some are books or pages, while others are fragments. Now, let's put this into perspective. The next closest ancient work is the Iliad by Homer, which has 1,800 manuscripts. 1,800 manuscripts. You know what's interesting? Most ancient works like Plato or Caesar have less than 20 surviving manuscripts, and yet few historians question the historicity of those documents. Nobody questions Plato's writings in terms of their historical claims, and yet we have less than 20 surviving manuscripts of Plato. We have 5,800 written or handwritten Greek manuscripts and more than 20,000 manuscripts in other languages of the Bible, and yet the Bible is more scrutinized and more questions than any other document. Why is that? It's an interesting question. Secondly, we have more earlier manuscripts of the Bible or the New Testament than any other document in history. Not only do we have a large amount of New Testament manuscripts, many of these manuscripts were also written very early, soon after the originals. The earliest undisputed manuscript is a segment of John 18, verse 31 to 33, and verse 37 to 38. It's known as the John Rylands fragment because it's housed in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, in England. So scholars date this particular fragment between AD 117 and AD 138. But some say it might be even earlier.
Perhaps the oldest fragment is papyrus number 52, also known as John Rylands papyrus number 457. And this is housed at the John Rylands Library of Manchester University in England. It was discovered in 1934 by C.H. Roberts, who was a man recently doctored, got his PhD in papyrology and in classics. And he was rummaging around in the library of the John Rylands and discovered this fragment that is no larger than the palm of my hand, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the interesting thing about this fragment was it was written on both sides. What that told him almost immediately, it was probably a Christian fragment. The reason is, if it's written on both sides, then it would have been written on a codex, which is our modern book form, invented at the end of the 1st century AD. A codex where you bind it on one side, then you have cut pages that you flip, as opposed to the roll or the scroll that all other books at the time had been written on. And so this is written on both sides. And John 18:31 through 33 was on one side, John 18:37 and 38 on the other. 90 years earlier than when C.H. Roberts discovered this fragment, in 1844 in the journal The Tübinger Jahrbuch, F.C. Bauer of Tübingen University had argued that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160. and most likely was to be dated about AD 170. He was basing this on philosophical constructs that he had learned from his professor of philosophy, Hegel, who had come up with Hegelian dialectic, which we may know as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so through a convoluted philosophical construct, Bauer argued John's gospel can't be dated any earlier than 160 and probably 170. And through that approach of bringing Hegelian dialectic into New Testament studies, what happened was European scholar after European scholar for the next 90 years started to late date the Gospel of John. Obviously, if it's in the second half of the 2nd century, then it has no eyewitness credibility to it, and so its historical reliability was completely dashed. But then when Roberts discovers this small fragment, he gets it published in 1935 after he had sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one of them wrote back to him and said, this manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150 and should be dated closer to AD 100. A fourth demurred. He said, no, I think this should be dated in the 90s of the 1st century. So you have these scholars who are saying the copy of John's Gospel can't be dated later than 150. It's probably closer to 100. Typically, we date that at about 125 now, but really it's a date between 100 and 150. But here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not written before the original of the document. This sent 2 tons of European scholarship to the flames and brought John's Gospel back into the 1st century. And with that and the Dead Sea Scrolls and some other things that have occurred in the last few decades, now we're beginning to see that John's Gospel has historical credibility.
The point is that the gap between the original New Testament documents, which are the autographs, and the manuscripts is very short, much shorter than any other document in antiquity. According to Dr. Frank Turek and Dr. Norman Geisler, the New Testament gap is about 25 years and maybe less. This is astonishing, especially when you compare it to Homer's Iliad, which has a gap of about 500 years between the originals and the manuscripts. But how old are the surviving manuscripts of the single New Testament books? Well, manuscripts that are largely complete New Testament books survive from about AD 200. So these are single New Testament books. For example, say the book of John or the book of 1 Timothy. So we have some of those books surviving from about AD 200. Then there are manuscripts that have most of the New Testament, including the Gospels, that survive from AD 250. There's also a manuscript that contains the vast majority of the New Testament, as well as a Greek Old Testament. It's called the Codex Vaticanus. It sounds like something Harry Potter would say. One of the spells he would do, Codex Vaticanus. This particular manuscript survives from AD 335, which is also the same period where the Nicene Council was held. Then there's the Codex Sinaiticus, dated AD 340. It's also a complete manuscript. According to scholars, those manuscripts have spelling and punctuation characteristics that suggest that they are in a family of manuscripts that can be traced back to AD 100 and AD 150. So, here's an important or interesting fact as well. If these manuscripts were all we had, scholars would be able to reconstruct the original New Testament with great accuracy. But wait, there's even more. The Bible is more abundantly supported in terms of manuscripts of the ancient world. Even if we lost the manuscripts that we do have, we would still be able to reconstruct the New Testament to a reasonable measure of accuracy. Why? Well, the early church fathers, these are men of the 2nd and 3rd century like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and others. These early church fathers quoted the New Testament approximately 36,289 times in their writings.
Now I'm going to do a real quick thought experiment in 2 minutes. Ready? Here we go. Let's just test this as devil's advocate. Let's just say, what if I said to you, okay, tell you what, Bart, I'll take every verse where you find a variation and we'll just chuck the entire verse just to be safe. So we'll go in here and we'll excise out a percentage. Now I'll tell you what, let's do better than that. Let's take out every 4th verse just for the sake of argument. Even Bart doesn't think every 4th verse should be removed. But just for the sake of argument, I'm going to take out every 4th verse. Let's see what it does to the story of Jesus. Let's see what's left. No, it's not even good enough. Let's take out every other verse. You decide if you want even or odd, Bart. I'll take out whatever you want. No skeptic in the world thinks there's this much damage in this New Testament. But I'm willing to give you that. The question is, what would be left? Would we have any reliable story about Jesus? Well, actually, you would. You know why? Because if I take this verse out of John's Gospel, and then I page over to Luke and find the parallel account in Luke, guess what? That account's going to be there. It's going to come back in because I've got to be able to overlap all 4 Gospels. And anything I take out of one is very likely going to be in the other one still. So I'm going to get a lot of this stuff's going to come right back in because the other 4 Gospels. But not only that, these authors, John and Matthew and Mark, they had students who listened to what they taught and then wrote what their masters taught. John, for example, had Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias, 3 students whose letters we still have today. They're not in your scripture. In those letters, they describe what it was John taught them. So half the data about Jesus are going to come back in by way of the church fathers, like Ignatius and Clement and Polycarp. Because whatever data you think is missing here, it's going to come right back in with the church. As a matter of fact, the church fathers who sat at the feet of the eyewitnesses and learned from John and learned from Matthew, they wrote their own documents. And in those documents, they quoted from all 4 Gospels. So if you're wondering what's in the Gospels, ask the people who learned from the eyewitnesses. They're going to put back all that data. Not only that, they actually quote from all these letters of Paul in the late first, early 2nd century. You can't get rid of that data because the church fathers have still got it recorded. If you look at what is described about Jesus by just the church fathers who learned from John, who learned from Matthew. You're stuck with Jesus, who's born of a virgin, who's a miracle worker, who claimed to be God, who was worshipped as God, who worked miracles, who died on a cross, who rose from the dead, who was raised up into heaven, who's seated at the right hand of a Father. That is what you have with Jesus. That story is hard to get away from because even the first generation of students of the disciples recorded what they said, what the disciples said. If you put that data back in, you're stuck with all this additional data coming back into the text. You don't lose anything by taking out half of the text. You're still stuck with the Jesus of history.
So, we not only have thousands of manuscripts, but we also have thousands of sightings by the early church fathers. As such, one could read nearly the entire New Testament simply by reading through the writings of the early church fathers. This is awesome. This makes the reconstruction of the New Testament fairly certain. But how certain is the question? So here's a clip by leading textual critic Daniel Wallace, where he speaks about why we can trust the New Testament even though manuscripts differ from one another.
We don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament. They all disappeared within a century, I'm pretty convinced, by copying and copying and copying. Frequent handling. The early church was far more concerned to get the gospel out than they were to do exact copying of the New Testament. And that actually is a blessing because they didn't have those kinds of controls. And consequently, you get copies that are not through just one stream, but tons of people all over the place are making these copies. So here's a man who lives in Corinth. He's going to be visiting Rome, and he says, hey, I heard Paul wrote a letter to you guys too. I want to write that out. Do you mind if I copy it when I get there? Sure, that's no problem. This happened, I'm sure, dozens and dozens of times over. And those manuscripts would have lasted as much as 80, 90 years, but would have fallen apart from all these copies being made. So we don't have the originals, they disappeared, and all the copies that we have disagree with each other at some point. Sometimes it's quite a few disagreements, but we have hundreds of thousands of textual variants among our manuscripts. So, a question to ask here is how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? It's absolutely proven that they did. No 2 manuscripts are alike, so unless one of them is pristine, every single scribe made mistakes. So because the original manuscripts disappeared and because no 2 copies agree with each other completely, we have to do textual criticism. We can't just rely on one, it's imperfect. So scholars have to reconstruct it on that basis. But when you look at the number of textual variants, and there's hundreds of thousands of them. As Bart Ehrman likes to say, there are more textual variants than there are words in the original New Testament. That's actually an understatement. But you have to not just look at the number of variants, you have to look at the nature of these variants. And the best estimates are that at least 99.8% of them affect nothing. Most are spelling differences. There's different ways to spell John. There's different ways to spell Mary. They're not going to affect anything. But the 1/5 of 1% that do affect things are the ones that scholars talk about and disagree over on a number of these issues. But the bottom line is, it does not matter in some respects which New Testament you use, because no essential doctrine is jeopardized by any of these textual variants. Even Bart Ehrman, who wrote Misquoting Jesus, can say the same thing. So that's true on that end, but at the same time, we want to know what the original text said in all the details. And so the great majority of scholars have very few disagreements over these passages. For example, most scholars would say the long ending of Mark's Gospel, Mark 16, 9 through 20, is almost surely not authentic. And they still put it in their Bibles, typically smaller print or in brackets or footnote. The oldest authorities don't have this. So there's a wide consensus on the vast majority of textual variants. And again, there's no essential doctrine that's jeopardized by any of these textual variants. That is extremely comforting. It's very important to know that.
Okay. So obviously, if you have thousands of manuscripts that were copied by human hands, you will have mistakes and even differences. But as Dr. Wallace points out, 99.8% of those differences affect nothing, and most of them are spelling differences. Furthermore, no essential Christian doctrine is affected or compromised by these differences, or what they call textual variants. So by comparing and cross-checking the different manuscripts, scholars are able to accurately and with reasonable certainty reconstruct what the original manuscript said. Okay, that's it for today, guys. It's a shorter episode, but I thought it's better to do a shorter episode than do an episode that's way too long. Just to summarize, we learned today that the Bible or the New Testament documents are the best attested documents of the ancient world. We have more manuscripts than any other ancient document. We have earlier manuscripts than any other document. And we have more abundant manuscript evidence from additional sources than any other ancient document. Based on this, even though there's many variants in the manuscripts that we do have, when we compare those manuscripts with one another, we can come to a reasonably certain conclusion of what the original manuscript said. That's awesome. In the next episode, I will look at 7 tests that historians, or 7 criteria that historians employ when trying to determine if an ancient document is reliable. Okay? Let me just go through the 7 with you real quick. Firstly, they ask the question, do we have early testimony? So generally speaking, the earlier the sources, the more accurate is the testimony. Secondly, they ask, do we have eyewitness testimony? So eyewitness testimony is usually the best means of establishing what actually happened. Thirdly, do we have testimony from multiple independent eyewitness sources? So multiple independent eyewitness sources confirm that the events really occurred, that they are not fiction or legend, and they provide additional details that a single source might miss. So true independent sources normally tell the same basic story, but with differing details. Historians sometimes call this coherence with dissimilarity. Number 4, are the eyewitnesses trustworthy? Should we believe them? So we look at their character. Okay. Number 5, do we have corroborating evidence from archaeology or other writers? This adds further confirmation. Number 6, do we have any enemy attestation? If opponents of the eyewitnesses admit certain facts that the eyewitnesses are saying are true, then those facts probably are true. For example, if your mother says you are brave, that might be true, but it's probably more credible if your arch enemy says the same thing. It makes sense? And then number 7, does the testimony contain events or details that are embarrassing to the authors? Since most people do not like to record negative information about themselves, any testimony that makes the author look bad is probably true. So in the next episode, we will look at these 7 criteria or tests, and we will apply it to the New Testament documents to see if they are reliable. Okay, thank you guys for listening. I hope this has been insightful, and thank you again for joining us on this journey. And hopefully so far you've learned a lot, as have I. As we continue to press forward to prove the reliability of the Bible and the truthfulness of the Christian faith, my encouragement to each of us is to remember that while we are discussing these intellectual concepts and matters, true Christian faith is not characterized just by intellectual knowledge of God. It is characterized by a heart and an affection for God that submits one's entire life to God. And this is my encouragement for us today, that these podcast episodes, as interesting as they might be to some, and maybe not to others, as interesting as they might be, this should not be a substitute for reading your Bible, spending time with God, spending time in prayer, belong to a local community of believers where you can engage with believers regularly, and in that way grow your love for God. Because knowledge that does not translate to love for God is futile. Okay? All right. So until the next time, guys, I thank you for listening, and remember, the truth matters, and so do you.